He will not force
Okay, the basic problem of free will comes down to the notion of moral responsibility. We think of people as morally responsible for what they do freely. We don't blame them for what they're forced to do, or at least we blame them typically a great deal less. Then we will often say they're not free, they have no choice in the matter. So that's a very commonsensical way of thinking about things. You can only be morally responsible for what you do freely of your own choice. But then, with the rise of science, it becomes more and more plausible to see ourselves as causally determined, that what we do actually has underlying causes in our brains, etc., that such that a being who knew everything about us would be able to predict in advance exactly what we were going to do. Well, if what I do is causally necessary, can I properly be blamed for that? Am I, in effect, not free if I'm determined? So determinism is the thesis that all events are determined by prior causes. So take any event, let's call it E, given the causal laws that govern the universe, whatever they are, given the prior state of the world, the state of everything in the world before E occurred, then E was inevitable. That's one way of understanding the notion of determinism. So here's a quotation from Hume's inquiry. It is agreed that matter, in all its operations, is actuated by a necessary force, and that every natural effect is so precisely determined by the energy of its cause that no other effect in such particular circumstances could possibly have resulted from it. So Hume there is saying that this is something that philosophers generally agree when it comes to the behaviour of physical things, material objects. But Hume wanted to argue that it's also true of human actions. And that is the thesis of universal determinism, that it's true not only of things in the physical world, but things in what one might call the moral world, the world of people and actions. Well, there are a number of different positions here, and it's very important to understand how they fit together. So, first of all, we need to ask, is the thesis that we have genuine free will compatible with determinism? Now, when I say genuine free will, what I take that to mean is the kind of free will that is required for moral responsibility. Is that compatible with determinism? Well, some people say no, some people say yes. If you say no, then you're an incompatibilist, and it follows that at most one of the two theses can be true. Of course, neither of them might be, but at most one of them can be. So those who say that we do have free will of the morally significant kind, but that determinism is false, they are called libertarians. So if you hear the word libertarian in the context of the free will debate, that's what it means. Someone who thinks that free will is incompatible with determinism, that we do have free will and that therefore determinism is false. On the other side, you get hard determinists. So a hard determinist is someone who says everything is determined, and it follows from that that we are not free, that we don't have morally significant freedom. So that's one side of the debate. Now, you might think of the libertarians and hard determinists as being fundamentally opposed, but actually, in some ways, their positions are quite close together, because they agree on the conceptual point that determinism and freedom are incompatible. And that's a pretty fundamental agreement between them. They simply disagree on, as it were, the facts of the matter, whether determinism is true or not. So on the other side of the debate are compatibilists. And compatibilists say that we can have free will even if determinism is true. Determinism and free will are compatible. Now, you can be a compatibilist without being a determinist. You can, in fact, I probably fall into that position myself. I think free will and determinism are compatible, but actually I don't believe in determinism because of things to do with modern physics. But those who take a compatibilist position and are determinists, which is certainly the vast majority of compatibilists down the ages, they are called soft determinists. Now, the consequence argument is a very well-known argument, particularly pushed by Peter van Inwagen, an argument for the claim that determinism is incompatible with free will. And it goes like this. If determinism is true, then all human actions are causally determined consequences of the laws of nature and prior conditions. That's just what determinism says. Hence, I cannot do otherwise than I actually do, except by falsifying the laws of nature or changing past conditions. If what I do inevitably comes about, given those initial conditions and given the laws, then the only way I could do something different is by changing the prior conditions, which obviously I can't, they're past, they're gone, or by changing the laws, and I clearly can't do that either. But if I can't do otherwise than I actually do, then I don't have free will. So if determinism is true, we lack free will. I've given it there in a very sketchy form. Of course, it can be filled out in various ways, but it looks quite a persuasive argument. The fundamental thrust of it is that if everything I do was, as it were, inevitable from before I was born, how can I possibly be said to be free? There's nothing I could have done different. Well, the traditional way of opposing this kind of argument, not just the consequent argument in its modern formulations, but generally the idea that free will is incompatible with determinism on the ground that I couldn't do otherwise if determinism is true, the standard way is to interpret I could do otherwise or I couldn't do otherwise differently. So the incompatibilist is saying that I can only be said to be able to do otherwise if it's causally possible in that exact situation for me to do otherwise. So the incompatibilist wants to say that I'm only really free if, put in that exact situation with the state of my brain and everything being exactly what it was, something different could have happened. Otherwise, I cannot be said to be able to do otherwise. Now, the compatibilist will take a quite different view. The compatibilist will prefer something like this. It would be possible for me to do otherwise in a similar but not identical situation in which I chose to do so. So the compatibilist says, well, I chose ice cream rather than fruit. It was a free choice. I could have done otherwise. I could have chosen fruit. Of course, in that situation where I had a preference for ice cream, it was inevitable that I was going to choose the ice cream, sure. But had I preferred the fruit, I would have taken the fruit. So I was entirely free to do as I chose. So that's a very different reading of could do otherwise. Now, Harry Frankfurt has argued that quite apart from this issue of interpretation, freedom doesn't even require the possibility of doing otherwise in either of these senses. So that's a rather more radical way of opposing the incompatibilist position. So here's an example. Suppose I go through door A. Maybe I need to get out of the building. Maybe there's some emergency or something like that. And there's two doors, door A, door B. I choose to go through door A. Now, that is a free action. I freely chose door A rather than door B. But suppose, in fact, door B is locked. Suppose, in fact, had I tried door B, I would have found I couldn't go that way and had to go through door A anyway. In that case, we have an example where in a sense, I had no choice. It was inevitable that I would go through door A. I couldn't do otherwise. But yet, in the circumstances where I chose to do door A, remaining completely ignorant about the state of door B, it seems plausible to say that I've done it freely. So therefore, it's possible to do something freely, even when you couldn't have done otherwise. And this illustrates that what makes an action inevitable doesn't always bring it about. What makes this action inevitable is that door B is locked. So in those circumstances, it was inevitable I was going to go through door A rather than B. But door B's being locked didn't actually bring it about that I went through door A. And Frankfurt gives some other examples. The usual kind of mad scientist crops up. Somebody who is able to predict in advance what I'm going to choose, and this person decides that if I choose to do what he doesn't want me to do, then he's going to interfere with my brain in some clever way and make sure that I actually do what he wants. Now, suppose in those circumstances I actually freely do what he wants me to do anyway. In that case, he doesn't have to take any action. I do what I do freely, but in fact I couldn't have done otherwise. I couldn't have done otherwise because he would have intervened. Well, there's a lot of interesting discussion about these cases. I mean, just to make one obvious objection, one can say, well, okay, maybe it was inevitable that I went through door A rather than B, but I did actually have a choice. I could have done otherwise. I could have tried door B before going through door A, and that would be doing otherwise than I did. In the case of the evil scientist, I could have embarked on the course of thought that would have led me to action B, in which case he would have intervened, but that would have been me doing otherwise than I did, which was quite freely to choose A. So the argument, as you can imagine, can get quite complex. Well, a couple of times in talking about freedom, the word choice has naturally appeared. I've been talking about choosing one thing rather than another, choosing freely, and so on. And I suspect that this close connection between freedom and choice lies behind the intuition, that is the natural thought, that to be free it has to be possible for you to do otherwise. In cases like the Frankfurt examples, with door A and door B, you can see that I do make a choice. I choose to go through door A, though in another sense I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice which door to go through because, in fact, door A is the only one that I could go through. So you can see that there are subtle nuances here in the notion of choice. The notion of choice is also slippery in other ways. Suppose, for example, I'm walking along the road, my phone goes, I pull it out of my pocket, and then some apparently agitated guy comes up to me with a gun, holds the gun to me and says, "Give me your mobile phone or I'll shoot you." Right. Do I have a choice? A case where it's absolutely blindingly obvious what I'm going to do. I'm going to give him the mobile phone. It's tempting to say, I don't have a choice. On the other hand, you can see that there's a sense in which I do have a choice. I could, if I thought he was bluffing, or I thought his gun was just a replica gun or something like that, or if I felt suicidal, I could refuse to give him the phone. So there's a sense in which I have a choice, a sense in which I don't. Suppose we're having some row, and perhaps in some laboratory where I'm wired up, and some clever neuropsychologist is deliberately putting me in a situation where I get very angry. He's able to look at the brain scans and say, Millican's going to hit him. Well, suppose he can predict that. Does it mean I don't have a choice? Well, you could say, in a sense, maybe it does, but in another sense it doesn't. Maybe the neuropsychologist can say, Millican's going to choose to hit him, in which case he's predicting that I will choose. Well, doesn't that mean that I do have a choice? So the notion is very slippery. It's very easy for the word choice to be bandied about in these discussions with no clear concept of choice in play. So be very wary. When you come across discussions in the free will debate, do not allow words like choice to be used without clarification of exactly what is meant by it. So let's distinguish various ways in which one might or various things that one might intend in saying, I had no choice. Well, one could mean that what happened was in no way dependent on my decisions or actions. One could mean that my actions were physically forced on me. I had no choice but to open the door. He was holding my hand and forcing it. We could mean that my actions were predetermined in some way by non-rational factors, perhaps drugs, perhaps brainwashing. We could mean that my actions were predetermined by my own desires and consequent reasoning. Now, that's a very odd sense of I had no choice. If in fact what I do is determined by my own desires and reasoning, I work out what I want to do, I work out how to achieve what I want, and then I make the decision based on those preferences and that reasoning, it's very odd to say there that I had no choice. But you will find that some people will say that. Finally, it might mean it was blindingly obvious what I should do. I suppose in the first round of the third round of the FA Cup, say, Manchester United are playing some very weak team that amazingly has managed to get through. And you might say, it was no contest. 20-0, it was no contest. You don't actually mean it was no contest. You mean it wasn't a meaningful contest. In the same way, sometimes it can be so obvious what to do, as in the case of the mobile phone and the gun, that we say, I had no choice. Actually, what we mean is, I had a blindingly obvious choice. Now, an argument that can be brought to bear here, I think quite powerfully, is called the paradigm case argument. This is an argument that was extremely popular in the heyday of Oxford ordinary language philosophy. It's far less popular now, but I think in this particular case, it has very considerable force. Let's ask what we mean by a choice. How do we learn the use of the word choice? Well, typical example might be, as a child, your mother offers you a choice of puddings. Ice cream, cake, fruit, which would you like? You make a choice. That's how we learn the meaning of the word choice, don't we? Go on, dear, it's up to you. You choose. That's where we get the notion of choice from. Now, if that's right, if that's, as it were, a paradigm case, a standard example of choice, the kind of case that we use to learn the meaning of the word, then how can it possibly be said that in such a circumstance we don't have a choice? It's very peculiar to say that. Now, all this does is sort out meanings of words. I mean, anyone who claims that this kind of argument can settle deep philosophical issues is probably deluding themselves. So my aim here is just to say it is or at least to suggest that it's an abuse of the word choice if you deny that that kind of circumstance involves a choice. You're detaching your use of the word choice from its normal meaning so far that it's hard to use it and keep any grip on what we mean by it. Thomas Hobbes was the first great compatibilist, and he argued for compatibilism in something like this kind of way. He wants to focus on what we mean by free. What do we mean by somebody being free? Well, liberty or freedom signifieth properly the absence of opposition. By opposition, I mean external impediments of motion. A free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to. And you can see that's a very commonsensical definition of freedom. The kind of notion that might match up to how we use the word in ordinary life. I freely chose it. Nothing hindered me from doing what I wanted to do. And you can see that if you define freedom in that way, it's entirely compatible with determinism. Not being hindered to do what I choose to do in no way is interrupted by the fact that I am causally determined, the fact that I'm causally determined to choose as I do, to reason as I do, doesn't in any way mean that I can't do what I choose. So we end up with a compatibilist position. Now, an argument that's very commonly used to support compatibilism, people like Hobbes, but also people like Ayer use this. In fact, it's a very standard argument in the compatibilist tradition. We can call the contrastive argument. Now, what the contrastive argument is doing is aiming to argue that the incompatibilist is making a fundamental mistake. They're drawing the wrong contrast. What is the contrast between things that are free and unfree? Well, the libertarian says it's the contrast between acts that are caused and those that are uncaused. But instead, the compatibilist wants to say the relevant contrast is between acts that are coerced, compelled, or constrained and those that are free of such influences. So the suggestion is that when we distinguish in ordinary life between free acts and unfree acts, we do not do it on the basis of whether they were caused or uncaused. We do it on the basis of whether someone was holding a gun to my head or pushing me or whatever it might be, compelling me or constraining me in certain ways to do one thing rather than another. So if I'm not coerced, compelled, or constrained, then I'm free. Now, the contrastive argument seems quite persuasive, I think, because it aims to link free will very closely with moral responsibility. And it does seem plausible that I can be absolved of responsibility for something I do or don't do in these conditions. Well, suppose I didn't do it at all. In that case, I'm clearly not responsible for it. Suppose I was compelled to do it. I had to do it. He had a gun to my head. Then I can be absolved of responsibility. Or suppose he pushed me. Or suppose I was coerced. In short, in all of these cases, we're inclined to say, I didn't do it freely. So Ayer uses the contrastive argument. Here's a brief quotation. For it is not, I think, causality that freedom is to be contrasted with, but constraint. So very clear statement of the contrastive argument. Now, some commentators on Hume think that he uses the contrastive argument as well, but in fact he doesn't. I think that's a mistaken interpretation of Hume. If you read stuff on Hume, you will often find people mentioning liberty of indifference and liberty of spontaneity. These are terms which are used in the Treatise of Human Nature, which is not the text that you read on this course, and I think that's a good thing. But that misleads some people. They think that Hume is drawing a traditional contrast, in other words, employing the contrastive argument. But in fact, Hume's notion of liberty is rather a different one. So here is a quotation from the Inquiry, which is the text that you are expected to read. And it's one of the classic contributions to the free will debate. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Now, notice Hume is not saying anything about things like coercion or compulsion. He's simply saying freedom involves doing what we choose to do or what we will to do. A power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. And he consistently goes on to say that this belongs to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. So if I'm a prisoner and in chains, then and only then, I lack this. Actually, I don't even lack it there, do I? If you think about it. I could will to rattle my chains, in which case I am acting according to the determinations of the will. So this is a very minimalist notion of liberty or freedom. Very minimalist indeed. So let's distinguish three different concepts of freedom. First of all, contra-causal, I think that means non-causal, libertarian free will, the kind of free will that the libertarians claim we have and claim is terrifically important. In that sense, free will is opposed to determinism. Second concept, intentional agency. And this is what Hume is getting at. That in virtue of which a person is an agent in respect of what he or she does. So if I do something willing to do it, I decide to do it, I do it because my will leads me to do it, then I am an intentional agent. Third concept, and notice that this is a different concept, and that is the absence of unwelcome restrictions affecting my choice of action. So this is where we get coercion, compulsion, political influences, the kind of influence that one resents. And that is surely the most common use of freedom, the word freedom, in ordinary language. We think we're free if there are no unwelcome constraints on what we do. But what Hume is saying is the key to morality is the second notion, intentional agency. So let's look at an example to focus our thoughts on this. Suppose I work in a bank. Someone takes my family hostage, comes to the bank, has photographs of my family locked up with brutal thugs around them, maybe gives me a mobile phone on which I can speak to my wife and she confirms, yes, they are being held, etc. They're clearly desperate gangsters, and I am told and I am convinced that it's true that unless I open the safe, my family is going to get killed. What do I do? I'm clearly acting under very significant coercion. But I do have a choice. I could choose not to open the safe. In fact, I would choose undoubtedly to open the safe. But one can imagine a different situation. Suppose the safe contains a nuclear weapon. In that case, I think most of us would say it's a very tough situation, but sadly, the family has to die. I think most of us would judge that, in that situation where it was something like that. But if it's mere money, open the safe, definitely. So notice what I'm choosing to do. I'm choosing to open the safe given that situation. Now that's a different choice from the case where somebody comes in, they're not armed, they haven't got my family hostage, and they say, open the safe or I'll beat you up. That's a very different choice. And I think in that case my decision would be quite different. So, although we describe the action, opening the safe, in the same way, it's a different action. And it's subject to different moral censure or otherwise. I want to say in the case where I open the safe because my family is threatened, I am morally responsible for what I do. But I'm not guilty because what I did was the right thing. It was the right thing to open the safe in those circumstances. It was the right thing to save my family. I would not judge a bank employee worse for doing that. I would think of him as an object of pity rather than blame for having been put in that awful situation. So in that situation where we do not hold that person responsible for what they do, or at least we do not blame them, notice, you don't have to say it's because it wasn't a responsible act. You can simply say it wasn't a blameworthy act. So again, let's contrast 4 different situations in which I could leave a lecture. First of all, I don't know, because of some student prank or whatever, people come into the lecture They bind me hand and foot, and they carry me out. I'm not trying to put ideas into your head. Well, in that case, I'm like Hume's prisoner and in chains. My leaving the lecture is something entirely beyond my power. Second case, somebody comes into the lecture waving a gun, tells me to leave the lecture straight away or they'll shoot me. Obviously, I leave. Third case, I come, stand here, see you all there, and suddenly I feel frightened, have a panic, and I run out. Can't control myself. Fourth case, I feel the lecture isn't going terribly well, so I pretend that I'm ill. Oh, dear, got to leave, excuse me. So, 4 different ways to leave a lecture. Now notice that one's assessment of these is completely different. In the first case, where I'm bound and carried out of the lecture, my leaving the lecture is not an action of mine. You can say that I leave the lecture, but in a sense, I don't leave the lecture. It's something done to me, not something I do. I'm not an intentional agent, so I'm not to blame. In the second case, where I'm threatened with a gun, I leave of my own choice. I do have the choice to stand here and risk getting shot, but I take the choice to walk out. I'm not blameworthy for doing so. None of you would say, oh, Millican's awful, he abandoned the lecture. You would say, poor Millican, fancy being threatened with a gun. It's the right thing to leave. So you don't have to absolve me of responsibility. You don't have to say I'm not responsible. You can simply say, yes, you are responsible and you did the right thing. The third case, that's the one where I have the blind panic, I have arguably done something wrong. I've abandoned a lecture that I should have been giving. But there are mitigating circumstances. The mitigation is that I had a blind panic. So you might say that I'm not blameworthy. But it's not because I haven't done something wrong, it's because there are mitigating factors. And notice that that is a different case from the second one. The fourth case is where I deliberately calculate to leave the lecture, I pretend I'm ill, I've done something wrong, I'm blameworthy. So once one distinguishes those options, I think it helps a great deal to sort out some of the problems that come in this area. One does not need to say that absence of blameworthiness implies lack of freedom. Sometimes you're not blameworthy because it's not something you've done at all. Sometimes you're not blameworthy because you did the right thing. Well, Hume's most distinctive contribution to the free will debate is different from this. I mean, I've argued that this definition of liberty is quite an important one, and I think it's a defensible one. The idea that a free action is one that you do intentionally, and that you're morally responsible or potentially morally responsible for actions that you do in those circumstances. And that if you're threatened with a gun or whatever, that doesn't change that you're acting intentionally. But Hume's most distinctive contribution to the free will debate is actually somewhat different from that. What he does in Inquiry Section 8 is to provide an argument for determinism. And he appeals here to the understanding of necessity that's in Inquiry Section 7. So be warned, when you read Inquiry Section 8, as you're required to for this course, if you don't know what goes on in Inquiry Section 7, you might find it a little bit confusing. So here's the passage in Inquiry Section 8 where he appeals back to what he has said in Inquiry Section 7. Our idea of necessity and causation arises entirely from the uniformity observable in the operations of nature, beyond the constant conjunction of similar objects and the consequent inference from one to the other. We have no notion of any necessity or connection. So, Hume's very famous contribution to the understanding of the notion of cause is this. He asks, what do we mean by one thing causing another, or one thing necessarily bringing about another? His answer is that we get the notion of causation purely by seeing constant conjunctions of things. We see motion of one billiard ball followed by motion in another ball, again and again and again. As a result, when we see the one moving, we naturally infer that the other will move. Remember what Hume says about induction. We do that just naturally by instinct. And he thinks that that instinct is what gives us the notion of causation. We find ourselves inferring B from A, and as a result, because we find ourselves making that inference, that's why we attribute a necessity to the connection between A and B, why we say A is the cause of B. The inference comes first. We find ourselves making the inference, that's why we say there's a causal link. Okay, so what he's now saying is, think about that notion of causation and necessity and apply it to the free will debate. What comes out of that? Well, if these circumstances, that is, constant conjunction and the consequent inference of the mind, if these circumstances form in reality the whole of that necessity which we conceive in matter, and if these circumstances be also universally acknowledged to take place in the operations of the mind, the dispute is at an end. Now that's from much later in the section. In between, Hume has given lots of arguments to say that this is the case. That if you look at human action, you find the same sort of consistency between motives and actions as you find between motion of one billiard ball and motion of another. Human behaviour is predictable in the same sort of way as the behaviour of the physical world. Of course, sometimes it's very complex. So is the physical world. Trying to predict the weather, for example, is extraordinarily difficult. Predicting the actions of people is often very much easier. And Hume makes the point with a lot of illustrations. He shows how everything we do in life, or almost everything we do, takes for granted a uniformity of behaviour amongst other people. We do treat people as predictable. He gives one rather gruesome example of a prisoner who is in a jail awaiting capital punishment. And he points out that the prisoner may reason that the walls are too strong for him to get through, the window is too strong for him to break. He foresees his death from the axe or whatever it may be. But he also foresees it partly because he thinks that he is not going to be able to influence the guard, because he foresees that he will be taken to the scaffold, that people will act in the way that they are prescribed to act. So in working out what's going to happen to him, he is combining reasoning about physical things and reasoning about moral things, that is, people's behaviour. And we do that quite naturally, all the time. We combine these kinds of reasoning. Well, in that case, if the only understanding we have of necessity or causality in the physical world comes from uniform behaviour and predictability, and if those apply just as much to the moral world, to the world of human action, then there's just as much reason for ascribing determinism to human action as there is to the physical world. So, most of Section 8, Part 1 is devoted to arguing these things, that human actions manifest uniformity. They're generally recognised as doing so. People standardly draw inferences about human behaviour just in the way that they do about physical things. So he says, what may seem rather paradoxical, all mankind have acknowledged the doctrine of necessity in their whole practice and reasoning, even while they profess the contrary opinion. So lots of people deny the doctrine of determinism, but actually Hume is saying in everything they do, they actually manifest a belief in it, a belief in causation governing human action. So why do they deny determinism? Why do they deny a doctrine to which their own behaviour commits them? Well, Hume thinks this is because people have a strong propensity to believe that they penetrate farther into the powers of nature and perceive something like a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. So this again comes back to Hume's understanding of causation. People think, when they see one billiard ball hitting another, they think they understand why it happens. Actually, Hume has said they don't. Remember about gravitation? That people thought gravitation was weird and incomprehensible. How can one thing attract another across space? They thought that was weird, whereas they thought the motion of billiard balls and collision of billiard balls was absolutely straightforward and comprehensible. And Hume's great contribution here is to say, no, it isn't. Actually, if you think about it, it isn't intrinsically comprehensible why billiard balls move as they do. And I argued in the second or third lecture that this was actually anticipating modern science. Modern physicists do not expect the behavior of things, e.g. in quantum mechanics, to be intuitively comprehensible. Well, if the behavior of billiard balls isn't actually really comprehensible in the way that people thought it was, then that can cure us of the illusion that somehow there is a greater necessity in physical things than there is in human behavior. At least, that's how Hume argues. Another important argument that he makes is that morality actually requires determinism, and here we get back to the issue of morality. Incidentally, there are a few more slides than you have. I'll give you them next time. So, what is the relationship between determinism and moral responsibility? The libertarians say if we're determined we can't be free, we can't be morally responsible. Hume actually turns that on its head and says, hang on, what is it that makes you morally responsible for what you do? Surely it is because the action arises from you. It's because you did the action, because the action was brought about by your intentions, your desires, your reasoning. That's what makes the action morally responsible. So determinism actually assists moral responsibility. It doesn't undermine it. How can an action which I do be one that I'm morally responsible for if it's actually, as it were, random that I did it, if it doesn't arise from enduring aspects of my character? So we've looked quickly at some of Hume's contributions here. At the end of this, and in the light of that argument that I've just described, you might well wonder whether free will is a coherent notion at all. Because despite all the arguments of the compatibilists, you might well think there is something odd about ascribing moral responsibility to us if everything that we do was inevitably determined 1,000 years before we were born. Doesn't that really make free will a dubious notion, despite all of the points that have been made? But now we see that there's a problem if you deny determinism. Suppose you deny determinism. Suppose you think that a lot of what happens in the world is random. A lot of human actions are brought about by factors that are not causally determined, in which, as it were, there are dice being thrown in my head when I do whatever I do. How does that make me morally responsible? It's hard to see that randomness helps at all. So the libertarian has quite a difficult challenge here as well. The libertarian has to explain how something can be meaningfully free in a morally important way and yet not determined. Well, one way round all this sort of thing is taken by Hume again. He only hints at this in section 8 of the inquiry, which you'll be reading, but it's important to be aware of it. Hume is what's called a sentimentalist in morality. Very important trend both in his day and in ours. The idea basically is this: morality is founded on our feelings, on our sentiments, on sympathy, or what Hume calls sympathy, what we might call empathy, and fellow feeling towards other people. So the claim is that morality is not some sort of metaphysical speculation. When I judge something right or wrong, I'm not doing that on the basis of philosophical argument, or very rarely so. I'm doing it on the basis of my feelings. I see somebody robbing an old lady. I feel resentment for the robber. I feel great sympathy for the person who's robbed. And it's that natural fellow feeling which gives rise to moral sentiments. At least that's the claim. Now notice that if you are a sentimentalist, if you take this kind of view, if you think of morality as something like a projection of human attitudes, then there's no reason at all why determinism should undermine it. So Hume gives this example. A man who is robbed of a considerable sum, does he find his vexation for the loss anywise diminished by these sublime reflections, thinking about determinism and so forth? Of course not. If I'm robbed of a considerable sum, the fact that the villain was causally determined to do it makes no difference to my resentment. I feel extremely angry. Why then should his moral resentment against the crime be supposed incompatible with them? So notice that there are different ways out of this. We don't need to be trapped by the metaphysical debate. We might be able to stand back and change our account of morality, or develop a proper account of morality that allows determinism and maybe allows randomness within it. So don't forget, when you're thinking about free will and moral responsibility and determinism, don't forget that questions can be asked about the nature of morality. And it's entirely possible that your answer to those questions will influence your view on free will and determinism. Well, you'll have gathered I'm quite sympathetic to a Humean approach on this, as on many other things. But there is a sense in which you might well think that it's rather too crude. Hume wants to say that we're free if we act in accordance with our will. Freedom is simply power to act or not act according to the determinations of the will. But surely we want to say there is a significant difference between different actions that are in accordance with one's will. Take a drug addict, or an obsessive, a kleptomaniac. They seem to be slaves to their will, in a sense that the rest of us aren't. Don't we want to say that they lack freedom in a particular way? And it looks like Hume and many other compatibilists are not going to be able to have a satisfactory answer to this. If you make the conditions for freedom so easy to meet that all that's required for a free action is that you do what you want to do, how can you distinguish between the drug addict and the normal autonomous person? Well, here we get back to Harry Frankfurt and his second very important contribution to the debate. He suggests a distinction between first-order desires, for example, maybe the desire to smoke a cigarette, and second-order desires, for example, the desire to quit smoking. So, the addicted smoker who realizes that he's addicted and wishes he could give it up, but can't, has a conflict in his desires. He's got a second-order desire to give it up. He's got a second-order desire not to desire cigarettes. And he has the first-order desire for the cigarette. He's not in control of himself at the higher level. And that gives us a way of saying that he is less free. So bringing this sort of consideration into a determinist, compatibilist account, I think helps a great deal. It enables one to distinguish between different degrees of freedom within a compatibilist framework. Now I'm just going to end very quickly by drawing to your attention what I think is a particularly interesting contribution on the indeterminist side. Most of the big philosophers who've discussed free will over the centuries have actually tended to be compatibilists. Compatibilism is by far the dominant trend. But Robert Caine has written a lot of stuff from the other side recently. He's written a number of books about free will, and when he describes the debates, he normally does so in a very even-handed and perceptive way, so I do recommend what he writes. And there's an article on the web here which gives an indeterminist picture which tries to get round the standard problems with indeterminism. So he gives the following example. Suppose I try to shoot somebody, but my aim's very unsteady. It's a chancy matter whether I actually hit them. But if I do hit them, I'm responsible. The randomness in no way undermines my responsibility. Well, now suppose that there are conflicting desires in my mind. I want to do A and I want to do B, but they're incompatible. But whichever one actually wins out, even if there's a random process in my mind that brings it about that one wins rather than the other, that doesn't prevent my being responsible. So he's saying randomness is compatible with responsibility. And he uses this to attack the argument against indeterminism, which claims that randomness undermines responsibility. And then he wants to go on to say that things like this, random episodes, random things in our mind that bring it about that one thing dominates rather than another, can over our lives end up building our character in such a way that later things that we do are determined by that character, but we are still responsible for them because they came about in this indeterminist way. And I think that's an interesting and imaginative contribution. The difficulty for him, I think, is explaining why even that element of randomness is valuable. One might agree with him that in those circumstances randomness is compatible with responsibility. It's very hard to see how randomness makes you more responsible than something that's straightforwardly caused. And at that point, I shall have to leave you to ponder the debate by yourselves. You can see it's a very complex issue with a lot of strands weaving together. I hope you enjoy reading more about it. Thank you.